Whoa, that's impressive. I'm like 300 feet away from my house. There are a bunch of different mesh routers out there. They all do more or less the same thing. In this video, I'm going to go over what makes the biggest difference between these different kind of Wi-Fi routers. I basically tried 3 different types or categories of mesh routers. The first would be kind of like your budget routers. The second category or type I tried was kind of your popular mesh router. This is the Eero, very common. And I tried a tri-band router. The most important things to me are speed, range, functionality, and reliability or consistency. So that's what I tested. The cheapest unit I tested was this Rockspace. You can get this as a 3-pack for just under $100. I also tested this Mesh Force, which is about $120 for a 3-pack. The Eero, which is about $200 for a 3-pack. And the most expensive unit I tried was this Tautronics Tri-Band, which is about $330 for a 3-pack. So for my setup, I put all of my routers in the same spot in my house. I only used 1 unit for a lot of my testing, and for the speed testing, I just tried the 1 unit. I went to fast.com and I tested the speed out, and they were basically all the same. They got to about 120 megabytes per second, which my internet plan is 100 megabits per second. All of these routers basically maxed out the capabilities that my plan allows. Thinking maybe it was an issue with fast.com, I went back and I tried out several different websites on all of my routers, and I more or less came up with the same results, that being they all got to about 120 megabits per second. The next test I tried was with LAN speeds, and what I mean by that is I want to grab a file from my computer that's on the top floor, and I have a server that's in my basement, and I want to transfer it from there and see how long it takes. So I got some software to do this, and I tested this with a 300 megabyte file and a 3 gigabyte file. As far as speeds went, Tautronics had the best read and write speeds. The Eero was not too far behind, and the Mesh Force and the Rockspace lagged quite a bit behind the more expensive routers. The next test I did with all these mesh routers was a range test. To do this test, I got an app on my phone that would test signal. I walked around everywhere in my house, and everywhere in my house I was getting great signal with all of the routers. I kind of put the routers in the middle of my house. I have a dome house, so everything's kind of equal distance to those routers. So finally I went outside and I walked, and I kept on walking, and just outside the house all of the routers were getting really good signal. I had to walk all the way to the corner of my street, which I went onto Google Earth just to find out how far this is. This is about 100 meters or 300 feet, and from this point I could actually find out which of these routers performed best range-wise. I was getting a 72% signal on the Tautronics router. You can see McLeoda or Christensen on my phone. That is what the Tautronics is. The Mesh Force and Eero was coming in both at about 61%, and the Rockspace was the lowest at about 53%. Honestly, I kind of did not believe these results because I'm 300 feet away. It was really cold in the morning. I wanted to run a speed test, but I just ran inside to get warm, came out later in the day, ran a speed test, and I did a speed test for the Tautronics router. And you can see my house here. I am 300 feet away. It's just 1 unit, just 1 router. I was getting 38 megabits per second. I mean, 38 megabits per second is not super fast, but it is fully functional. Considering how far away I was from my house, I was outside. I'm really impressed with the range of at least the Tautronics, and these other units got pretty impressive range as well. The next test I did was with functionality, and to test this out, I went into the apps of all these different routers and tested to see what functions you could do with these. And honestly, they were more or less the same. All of the apps had a really simple setup. All of the apps let you set up a guest network. All of the apps let you set parental controls as well. And then all of the apps had basic settings like specifying your DNS or whatever. Like I said, basically all the same, just a different interface. One difference I did see with the Tautronics mesh router, you can actually set static IP reservations, which is something actually really important to me. That being said, I never found a way to remove or delete the reservations. I just use my Ubiquiti router to do all of that anyway. That's kind of nice if you want to be able to set that in the router itself. Hey, my son is going to join me for the rest of this video, not because he's super knowledgeable about mesh Wi-Fi routers, because I don't think he is, but because he's making a lot of noise, and I'm hoping this distracts him. We'll see. Look, a remote! Amazing! Press buttons! So the last thing I wanted to test was reliability and consistency. What do I mean by this? Basically, if you get a router, how often are you going to have to reset it? How consistent are the speed? How often do you have issues with the router? That sort of thing. Here's what I noticed. With budget routers, say for example this Rockspace router. Rockspace actually reached out to me and sent this unit to me for free, which was great. And I tested it out, and the first unit they sent me, it just did not work reliably. I'd be connected to it, it would work, and then it would die. It would happen again, it would die. I let them know this. They sent me another unit, and honestly, the second unit I've had, it's been amazing. For less than $100, I'm really impressed with the unit. That being said, the fact that I had to go through 2 units is a bit concerning. And I think this is a problem you run into with budget routers. I had a similar experience with the MeshForce router. This worked great for me for a really long time, but after a while it had some issues where I'd have to reset it. And we're talking like maybe once every 3 or 4 months, which isn't a lot, but that is something to consider. With the Eero, on the other hand, like this is a very well-known router. Very popular. I've never had an issue having to reset it. It's worked great for me. The Tautronics router, same deal. So these more expensive routers, I've never had a problem with reliability or consistency. They just work really well. I think this is one of the biggest differences you're going to notice when you go from these budget routers to some of the more expensive. With budget mesh routers, I think you're going to take a little bit of a risk, and the consistency and reliability is probably not going to be there as much as some of these more expensive routers. In that same vein, something like the Eero, this has a lot of firmware updates. It's very popular, so it's easy to find support. With the Tautronics, I've had a lot of firmware updates as well. It's not as popular, so finding support is not as easy. But these budget mesh routers, they have virtually no support, and honestly, I've never seen a firmware upgrade with either of them. So that is something to keep in mind. If you're trying to save money, you might not get the reliability that you want. So ultimately, as a consumer, which type of router is best for which kind of person? As far as budget mesh routers go, honestly, I think for most people, this would be an okay option. Like I've mentioned, reliability and consistency might not be there, but that being said, I used the MeshForce for 2 years and was totally happy with it. I think most of the time, most budget routers will work out well. If you get one and you notice a problem right away, if you buy it on Amazon, you can just send it back. Being able to do that gives you a lot of flexibility with trying out something cheaper like a budget mesh router. That being said, with budget routers, you can't connect as many devices. You typically don't have the faster speeds. So if you want to run something like a media server, or a file transfer server, budget routers are probably not the best option. If all you need is an internet connection and the plan speed you have is not very high, budget routers will probably work just fine for you. If you run a small business though, or you have a lot of devices, or you want to set up different servers in your home, you really need to consider something a little bit more expensive. The Eero I've been really happy with, but ultimately the Tautronics is the one I've ended up using. It's got the fastest file transfer speeds of all the routers I've tried. It's been 100% reliable and consistent. I've really liked using it. It's been a great router for me. The only drawback with the Tautronics is just that it's not super popular, so I don't expect a lot of support for it. I have, however, seen some firmware updates with it. That's promising. Not as many as I see with the Eero, but it's still good to know that they're working on it and developing it. One thing I want to point out with the Tautronics router is that it is a tri-band router. I won't go into the details of what tri-band means, but basically if you get a tri-band router, it's able to get you the fastest speeds better than a dual band router is. So that's something to consider. If speed is an important thing for you, then you probably want to pay the extra money to get a tri-band router. Overall, mesh is a great option over your typical single router. The reason I really like mesh routers is that you can extend Ethernet ports instead of having to wire your whole home. I have a weird dome home. There's no way I'm ever going to be able to wire the whole thing. So mesh Wi-Fi is really my best and cheapest option. It's worked really well for me. And honestly, I've been pretty happy with all the mesh routers I've tried. Really the only drawback for me with mesh routers is with every mesh system I've seen, you have to use a phone to set it up. I prefer doing things on the computer. That's just personal preference. I know a lot of people would probably prefer the phone. A few tips for you if you are looking to get a mesh system. For one, check your internet service provider speeds. Make sure that the mesh Wi-Fi that you're looking to get has faster speeds than your internet service provider speeds. Otherwise, you're just going to be paying for something you can never use. The other thing to be aware of is how many devices you need to plug into the internet. I've been really surprised with how many devices I actually have. I have more than 60 devices. Most of them are just like tablets or phones or smart outlets or Wi-Fi lights, or it adds up. Keep that in mind. My recommendation is that you should estimate about how many you think you'll need and then double that. My son left. That's all I have. If you have questions, let me know. Write a comment. If you look in the video description below, I will write some more details about the mesh units that I have tried and my thoughts and opinions on them. You can also check out the current price for each of these units. So there you have it. Have a good day.